Okay, so I'm Kyle Friedrich. My paper that I did was on Kingdom Hearts and the narrative paradigm, kind of talking about why the Kingdom Hearts series, 14 years later, is still a really successful franchise. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Kingdom Hearts, a little bit of background on it. Kingdom Hearts is a video game series that was first introduced back in 2002. It's a collaboration between Disney and the video game developer Square Enix. That's essentially a crossover between classic Disney stuff and Square Enix's Final Fantasy video game franchise. It's one of the 80 top best-selling video game series in the world. And as you'll see in this quick little clip from Square Enix about their fans, a lot of the fans are people who grew up playing it as children, but still remain fans into adulthood across the world.
It's a barrage of feelings.
Friendship, unbreakable connections.
It's everything I love.
Been a fan for so long.
Starting Kingdom Hearts when I was about 9 years old.
I was in 4th grade.
En fait, je crois que c'est un jeu qu'on partage entre amis.
Tout à fait.
Sin duda es mucho más que un videojuego.
Desde que abrí el juego, no he podido dejarlo hasta hoy.
Es ist einfach super und ich würde es nicht mehr missen wollen.
It's just awesome.
There's no other way to put it.
So currently there have been 8 individual titles released for the series on a variety of different formats. Each game in the series has been re-released in some format or another over the years, and there are 2 new titles slated for the near future. So obviously over time, a series that definitely hasn't died off. It's still very strong. There's still a lot of demand for it, even almost 15 years later. And for those of you who don't know the story of Kingdom Hearts, basically it's this idea that Kingdom Hearts specific characters that were created originally for the game, like Sora and whatnot, travel around to these different worlds based on Disney movies, mostly the animated ones, although some live action ones like Pirates of the Caribbean and Tron have showed up as well. And they travel around with Donald, Goofy, Mickey to save these worlds from the power of darkness that usually come in the form of Disney villains or these creatures known as the Heartless and the Nobodies. And along the way they meet characters from Square Enix's Final Fantasy video game series. So a theoretical background talking about the narrative paradigm, it's basically a way of looking at stories to see, why do people like stories, in other words. It was developed by Walter Fisher, and he said that people are essentially storytellers, that storytelling is the main way that we communicate in just about any type of time that we communicate. And he says that we make decisions on whether we like a story, whether we incorporate it into our own values based on good reasons, and these good reasons that he talks about, they're determined by our history, our culture, and our character. We decide if a story has good reasons based on that story's situation, media, and genre. And Fisher says that we tend to like the good stories, so that's not necessarily to say that we can't like bad stories. For example, you think of Breaking Bad, obviously, Walter White, definitely more of an anti-hero, certainly not exactly the role model. So we can like more of those types of stories, but he said in general we do tend to prefer the good stories with those good universal values. And he said that a good story would have a positive impact on its audience. So narrative rationality and narrative paradigm, it's based on these 2 ideas. One is coherence. So we decide if a story is good, if it makes sense. Do events in the stories logically fit together? Is it internally logical? So, for example, if you have a story set in a medieval fantasy setting, it would make sense to have dragons flying around there, but not so much something in the modern day or in a sci-fi story. And our characters' actions consistent with who they are and what they value in their past experiences. And then the other principle for the narrative paradigm is fidelity. Does the story use good reasons? Are we able to see in that story values that either reflect our own or at least things that we recognize as being values that other people have? And so he talks about also this idea that we decide whether we like the story more based on identification rather than deliberation. So typically after we hear or see a story, we're not going to sit down and go through a huge deliberate thought process about whether we liked it or not. We decide whether we liked it or not because we either identify with the characters or the values that are expressed within that story. And so applying this to Kingdom Hearts, that raises 2 questions. One is, how does the series manage to combine classic Disney and Final Fantasy stories into a coherent narrative? So on the one hand, you have all these, classic Disney stories being combined into a greater narrative and being interrupted by the Kingdom Hearts narrative. And at the same time, you're taking these Disney stories and throwing Final Fantasy into the mix. So how do you weave all that together into a coherent narrative that makes sense to the audience? And then the second question is, why does the Kingdom Hearts series resonate with its audience in terms of these good reasons, these good values, as Fisher would define them? So talking about the coherence of Kingdom Hearts, one of the big things that helps with this coherence, mixing all these different stories together, is this idea of separate worlds. The Disney characters are largely supposed to remain in the world that is based on their respective movie. So, for example, you don't have Peter Pan showing up in Wonderland and flying around and doing stuff there. Some exceptions to this would be kind of like Disney's original cartoon characters like Donald and Goofy traveling around with Sora to these different worlds. Sometimes Mickey Mouse will show up. But since these are kind of Disney's original characters, or kind of the public face of the Disney company, they can really be associated with any type of Disney media, and they're not tied to any specific Disney franchise, so they're free to move around and show up in other character stories. Then you have the character Maleficent, who obviously is from Sleeping Beauty. But in other Disney media, she's definitely kind of portrayed as this mistress of all evil, kind of the ringleader of the Disney villains. For example, think of the show Fantasmic down in Disney World. She's kind of like the main villain in that. So it makes sense for her to be going around and scheming with these other Disney villains in their respective worlds. Then you have the princesses of Heart, who are all Disney princesses except for Kyra, who's a Kingdom Hearts character. They do all meet up at one point in the original game, but they meet up in a world that was created specifically for Kingdom Hearts, so you're not having Snow White show up in Cinderella's world and interrupting that story. And Disney princesses are typically marketed together, so you would, in a game, it makes sense for them to kind of show up and meet up with each other. And then also Merlin and the Fairy Godmother in the original game, they kind of act as Sora's magical guides. They teach him how to use magic and whatnot. But if you think about the source material that they come from in their respective movies, they're filling that role of the magical guide to the young protagonist. So they're still doing that same role in the Kingdom Hearts series. So it makes sense that even if they're meeting up in the same kind of context as their original source material. And so this separation of the worlds preserves their original story environments. Also there's this idea of maintaining the truthfulness of the original stories when talking about combining them with this Kingdom Hearts narrative. You do have Sora and the Heartless showing up and taking the plot of these original Disney stories in a different direction than they are in their original movies. But Martin and Taylor in 2006, they took a look at video games like Kingdom Hearts, and they said that people are willing to accept the new narratives offered by these games because the original story matches the original narrative schema of adventure video games. And they also said that when retelling a familiar tale, not all of the original elements need to be present in order for the story to still make sense. So, for example, take a look at Kingdom Hearts: The Alice in Wonderland storyline. Obviously different than the original Lewis Carroll book or even the Disney movie, but you still have those familiar elements of the Cheshire Cat popping up, giving cryptic answers to everything, the White Rabbit running around all frantic, the Queen of Hearts just being angry about everything and keep saying off with their head. So you still have all of those original elements present, even if it's a different story, and so it still feels like an Alice in Wonderland story, even with the Kingdom Hearts narrative mixed in. And then just kind of how Final Fantasy plays into this. It brings over characters from the Final Fantasy series, but they generally stick to those worlds that are created specifically for Kingdom Hearts, so they're typically not showing up in Disney movies or interacting with Disney characters outside of like Donald and Goofy too much. The one exception would be the world based on the Hercules movie, but if you consider the characters who do show up here, you've got Zack Fair from Final Fantasy VII, who, if you know him from that series, he's all about becoming a hero, so he really fits in kind of with that true hero quest narrative of the Hercules story. Then you have Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. He's obviously kind of got his dark revenge quest against Sephiroth, which makes him showing up in the original game and being manipulated by Hades, and Hades saying, hey, help me out, help me kill Hercules, and I'll help you fight Sephiroth. That kind of makes sense with Cloud's character. And then you have Auron from Final Fantasy X. He shows up in his original game. He's a dead guy who's still wandering around the land of the living, and so seeing him in the underworld in Kingdom Hearts 2 makes sense. So, So Final Fantasy, when they kind of bring this into Kingdom Hearts, they bring over the characters, not so much the plot. So you have a lot of the characters from Final Fantasy VII, for example, showing up and knowing who each other are, but outside of that Cloud and Sephiroth conflict, the narratives don't really carry over to interrupt the Disney narratives or the Kingdom Hearts narrative. And then talking about the fidelity of Kingdom Hearts. So Kingdom Hearts just kind of as a genre, it's got all these Disney stories that most of us grew up with as children. Those Disney stories, we kind of internalize the values of those over the years. So when we see them pop up again in these games, they're values that we can kind of automatically connect with those good reasons, as Fisher would call it. Kingdom Hearts is a role-playing game, so you're immersed in the character situation. The gameplay is really driven a lot by storytelling and kind of identifying with the characters. So when the fans can identify with the characters, they can identify with the values that are expressed as a resulting story of it. So kind of taking a look at some of those good reasons that Kingdom Hearts offers. One big theme of the game is this idea that good will win, light will triumph over the darkness, that people are essentially good and that we all have an inner strength of character. And there's also this idea of kind of forgiveness and redemption. These are all things that, as a culture, kind of universally across the world, people are taught that we're all, good people inside. That even if you mess up and kind of go over to the dark side for a little bit, it's never too late to turn around and make yourself a better person. The Kingdom Hearts series definitely exemplifies this in the character Riku, who in the original games gives into that darkness in his heart, gets possessed by the Heartless Ansem, but in later games turns around and finds that light within himself to team up with Sora and fight the darkness. So Kingdom Hearts has a lot of quotes like the following.
The heart may be weak, and sometimes it may even give in. But I've learned that deep down there's a light that never goes out.
And that theme gets reiterated in just about every game. Another strong theme in Kingdom Hearts that we can kind of identify with as those good universal values is this idea of the power of friendship. Throughout the games, the protagonist will always develop strong bonds with his friends. He has this desire to protect his friends and stay connected with them, even if he or she gets separated from them. And there's also this idea of maintaining friendship in spite of difficulties. So at some point in their lives, everybody's, they've had conflicts or fights with their friends, but still wanted to make up and repair that friendship afterwards. So those are all strong themes that we experience in our own lives across the world that you reflect back in Kingdom Hearts, particularly in 350.
Although my heart may be weak, it's not alone. It's grown with each new experience, and it's found a home with all the friends I've made. I've become part of their heart just as they've become a part of mine. And if they think of me now and then, if they don't forget me, then our hearts will be one. I don't need a weapon. My friends are my power.
Go on, you just keep running. But I'll always be there to bring you back!
Don't ever forget. Wherever you go, I'm always with you.
So a lot of those quotes about friendship that appear in every single Kingdom Hearts game probably get mentioned at least once every cutscene. So that's a thing that if you're a person who values friendship, which just about every single person on the planet does, you can connect with those themes and values in the game. And then there's also this idea of, Fisher talked about identification. This is how we decide if we like the story. So Kingdom Hearts certainly provides a lot of role model characters. You look at the main character, Sora, is the eternal optimist, always does the right thing pretty much. But it also provides characters whose problems we can identify with, who are a little bit more human, who have those kind of character faults, but because of that, they're more relatable to us, and if we can relate with their problems, we can relate with the values that come about as a result of their story. So prime example of this would be Roxas from Kingdom Hearts 2 and 358 over 2 days. Roxas is very relatable for teens and young adults, who would be pretty much the primary target audience of the series, struggling to define his identity, really unsure about his future, has a lot of conflicts with his friends, and if you know this character, you've played the games, particularly 358 days, gets a lot of general emotional angst with this character.
I hardly know who I am. What is so wrong with wanting some answers?
No one would miss me.
That's not true. I would. I am me! Nobody else!
So anybody who's kind of experienced similar problems to Roxas can connect with his story and kind of connect with those good reasons, those good values that come out of it. And so Kingdom Hearts definitely does a good job of providing good reasons by providing these aspirational stories and characters that kind of touch on those good and helpful values of society that are found across the world. Fisher describes love as the highest virtue or motivation in life. Kingdom Hearts certainly lives up to that as the core of the game with these role model characters, values of friendship, forgiveness, loyalty, and love, providing characters and situations that the fans can identify with. And as Fisher says, a good story will have a positive impact on its fans. which I think the Kingdom Hearts series has definitely had, as we'll see in another clip of that video from Square Enix.
It's a really big game because it was the first time I actually felt like games could have stories that were as good as or better than movies.
It's the story that I needed to hear.
Deep down, there's a light
That'll never go out.
Characters connected emotionally. It was different than any other game.
Who could you relate to more than Roxas?
Riku, definitely.
Terra, Aqua.
Axel.
In conclusion, Kingdom Hearts is definitely a good story, as Fisher would define it, which is why it's such a popular series across the world, why it's so commercially successful and leaves a lasting impact on its fans. It has those elements of coherence by maintaining the integrity of those original Disney stories, integrating Final Fantasy into that without interrupting the narrative of the Disney stories or the Kingdom Hearts story. And it has the fidelity with these universal themes that people value, providing relatable characters and experiences, and it achieves this in part through that fantasy RPG format. So.